Hello and welcome to this Power BI tutorial with me, James from Matador Software. Today we're going to look at why and when we would use DAX Calculated Columns and 3 real-life examples that you can follow along with. So before we go into my simplified version, if we look at the Microsoft documentation, it's clear. Essentially, what it says, calculated columns utilize DAX, the same as measures do, but really, how we differentiate is we use measures for values and calculating results. Calculated columns, we want to use these to add data, create new fields, and yeah, that's the most simple way of defining it. And Microsoft did quite a good job there. I'd like to take my own spin on it, add a few things that are true. One thing that we need to bear in mind when we're using calculated columns, they do use RAM, so we need to consider that. But they are great for adding to our data models or building insights on top of our existing data. They don't aggregate like a measure would. They use the current row as the context, so we need to be wary of that. But really, you should add a calculated column if you want to potentially see these values in a table. You don't want a single scalar value output. And we can use calculated columns for smaller tables with less rows. Like I said, these are sort of iterated through in the table, and the time that they're processed is different from measures. So if we were to put this simply, if we had 1 million rows of data, probably a calculated column may be inefficient and it would slow our process down. Whereas if we were using a measure, they use sort of virtual tables, so that might be a better way to do it. But yeah, hopefully that clears things up. Let's use calculated columns if we want to see our values in a table and the data sets aren't too large. Well, this is a great thing that we can use using DAX. So my data here and what I'm going to use to showcase this is very simple. I've created mock data, essentially stores, and with their city, region, country, the sales and the trading status, so whether the store is open or closed. And we're going to use 3 real-world good examples to showcase probably what you commonly see people use calculated columns for. And then I'm going to go into slightly more complex examples using if logic and switch statements. So predominantly, when I think of calculated columns or examples I've seen in the past, they're always pretty simple. And we're going to look at how we can combat that, but it is good to highlight this initially. So a good thing that we could do is sort of concatenation or joining together text. So let's say for some reason we've got a system or we just want to be more efficient with our column spacing. We could actually take the store city, the country and the region, and we could combine these together and just put them in one column and make our tables look better and the way we work slightly more efficient. So how would we do that? Well, we don't actually need to call a function at the start, like calculate or if. We're actually just taking the key elements of the table. So we're taking the columns. We've got an ampersand and quotation marks with a comma and a space after in the quotation marks to denote that, after each of these pieces of text, row by row, we want a comma just to separate things. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. And when we click on this, we'll see the result. It's pretty clear. So if I go ahead and finish this calculated column, drag it into the table, it's as we expected. So we've got London, England, UK, Manchester, England, UK, and so on. So we're just taking, like we said, that city, that region, and the country, and we're joining them together. So, okay, I see this done a lot. It is important to highlight. This wouldn't work in a standard measure, just the way that it's constructed. We would need to do this in a calculated column. So important to note that as well. But we're going to look at some slightly more complex examples now. All right, so here's a nice example, and we're going to use the if functions. We're going to have a bit of if logic, which is quite nice. And what we're going to do, I see this trading status column, so we can basically see if a store is trading or not, but that might not make sense to everyone. So let's, like we said, at a basic level, look to add more insights and make this more accessible for our consumers or our end users. After all, that's who we need to make these things. We need to have in mind when we make these reports and dashboards. So what we're going to do, you can see it says there needs to be a logical test and then a result if true and a result if false. Might not be very clear. You might wonder what a logical test is, but I'm going to show you. So you'll see the first element, we're saying if the trading status column is equal to trading, that text string, that's why I had to put in quotation marks, it's going to look for that. That's our logical test. So we put a comma, move on to the next stage. Afterwards, I'm saying the result if true, if that's the case, if that column equals trading row by row, we can make it so that it says store open. And the result if false, we're basically saying if that isn't present, if it doesn't say trading, we'll just put store closed because the only other option is not trading. So now if we finalize this calculated column and we pull it into our table, you'll see it works as expected. Everything that was set as trading says store open, and not trading, store closed, as we would expect. Okay, so as promised, we said for this third example, we'd gradually look at slightly more complex things. We've looked at the basic concatenation, we looked at if logic and if statement, and now we're going to use switch, which is actually just a nested if statement like you would use in Excel. It's a bit more powerful, a bit nicer, a bit more intuitive. So what we're going to aim to do is basically group a store by its sales and create a new column as we're using DAX Calculated Columns. So we've got the store sales grouping, we're using the switch function, and true is just another example of that logic, like that if logic. So essentially what we're saying, the expression if it's true, and we then need to put some values and the resulting factor of those. So what I'm saying here, it should become more apparent as we go through it. For every store where the sales are greater than 500,000, we're just going to add that result. So what we're going to place row by row, and we're just going to call it a top performer. And now we go through and do exactly the same process, but it's much cleaner than an if and having to nest things. The switch is great. It's essentially just a more powerful version of our if function. So now we can go through and say where the store sales are equal to or less than 500,000, the exact opposite almost. We can just say that these are, you can name this how you want, but what we will call this is, let's say something like a low performer. And that's going to capture what we need to right now. But you can see how we're starting to build extra insights through DAX Calculated Columns, and that's what we want to do. We want to take people's data and make it even more accessible and intuitive so that people can make data-driven decisions in an instant. And we'll just say anything else, we've got that blank feature. We're not going to need it right now because our rows are classified anyway within the sales, but we'll finish it off there. We'll do things correctly. And now if we use that and load it in, everything should work as expected. So we'll drag that into our table. And as you can see, we can see that London, which was over that 500,000, is a top performer. Manchester at 320,000 is a low performer. So it's they're slightly longer DAX calculated columns. They're not massive. They're not long by any extent. But you can see how as we gradually make things a bit more complex, everything becomes a bit more intuitive. So what I'm doing, I'm just doing a bit of formatting, and I'm just going to show you, highlighting that nice gold, the three columns that we created with DAX. Yeah, and we can look at the extra insights that we've added to our dashboard, our simple table. Alright, so great. We've taken a very simple data set, mock data set that I created, and we have then added some pretty good insights considering the data that we started with. I guess to reinforce a few things that we want to bear in mind, it does use RAM. It's a bit more clunky if you're using calculated columns in large data sets. If you just want a single value to display in a report, use a measure. But if you want to add data or use things like tables, definitely use a calculated column. As usual, if you like or enjoy this content, please feel free to subscribe, comment, like, and share. Thank you.